The Wealth of Some Nations, section, Social Imperialism in the Interwar Years. The mass mobilization of labor and the levée en masse of troops, which the expansion of capitalism overseas in the preceding century had hitherto allowed the ruling bourgeoisies to avoid, meant that the European working class was in a greatly strengthened position during and after the First World War. Indeed, many workers enlisted not only out of a sense of nationalist duty, but also as a means to advance their class interests, in the assumption that the sacrifices they made would bear fruit in the form of higher pay and an extension of welfare reform. As the war dragged on and became increasingly hellish for its participants, labor militancy spread like wildfire across Europe, particularly in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917. After the war, European social democracy enjoyed much greater political influence and living standards, and so again after the Second World War. It did not use its political and social standing to combat imperialism, however. On the contrary, for it was imperialism which allowed the bourgeois elites to incorporate a highly organized and powerful labor movement into capitalist state structures. Paul Lensch, an early opponent of revisionism in Germany's Social Democratic Party, SPD, wrote a book at the war's end in 1918 that was an open endorsement of Germany as a revolutionary vehicle for state socialism as against the, quote, bourgeois individualism of England. Lensch considered that after the war, Germany would be enabled to recover by means of an efficient, socialist exploitation of the resources of the colonies, something which would equally benefit their, quote, primitive inhabitants, as it would the German working class. Beginning of long quote. After the war, colonial policy will be of the nature of a social policy, for only if the colonial representatives of a government were conscious of their responsibilities as guardians of the interests of the colony, would there be any prospect of making the colonies what, in the interests of our whole culture and material conduct of life, it is essential that they should be, the pillars of that international, or rather intercontinental, division of labor by which the temperate zones are supplied with those indispensable raw materials and fodder-stuffs, without which the maintenance of our industrial and agricultural development is impossible. We cannot in the future allow these productive districts, full of unquarried wealth, to be abandoned to chance or to the money-getting instincts of private capitalists. In order to recover economically from the terrible catastrophe of the war, we need to develop all the productive powers at our disposal. Just because in the colonies the cream has already been skimmed off the surface, the tropical zone will in future only yield up its treasures as the white man undertakes the prodigious work of opening up and cleansing of the tropics. End of long quote. The reconstituted Second International was established in Bern, Switzerland, in February 1919. When, in 1920, the headquarters of the Second International were placed in London, the British Labour Party effectively took charge of the moribund organization's affairs. Unsurprisingly, the post-war Second International's first priority was not to advocate self-determination for the colonies, to India or to Ireland, but rather to relentlessly insist on its utmost urgency for Georgia, where the country's Menshevik government had distinguished itself by putting down peasant revolts, especially amongst the national minorities, suppressing the Communist Party, and waging war with Armenia over disputed territory. Footnote. In September 1918, Georgia's Menshevik president, Noe Georgiana, had declared to the German commander, "It is not in our interests to lower the prestige of Germany in the Caucasus." By January the following year, following Germany's rout, however, he was praising the British Commander General Walker as the first person that understood the state of affairs in our country. End of quote and end of footnote. At its Brussels Congress of 1928, the Second International adopted a social democratic program for the colonies, favoring the extension and intensification of the League of Nations mandate system, essentially a pseudo-democratic form of imperial annexation. protection of native labor and living conditions, and gradual socioeconomic and political reform in the direction of home rule government, other than for China, Egypt, Iraq, and Syria, which should become independent. However, given its increasing rightward and anti-communist drift, even this was to become a dead letter. Indeed, the more left-wing successor organization to the defunct Second International, the Labour and Socialist International, generally supported colonialism, with partial exceptions. Although some cooperation at the trade union level did take place, hostility towards radical nationalist movements in the colonies was strong in the European labor movement before the Second World War, preventing solidarity between the socialist parties of the imperialist countries and the socialist and nationalist organizations of the colonial world. During the interwar period in France, government policy began to transform overseas possession into colonies, a shift in policy which may be attributed to the rallying of socialists to colonialism. In 1925, Léon Blum, the leader of the Socialist Party in France, SFIO, who introduced labor legislation designed to protect native rights in, quote, French India, stated, quote, "We recognize the right and even the duty of superior races to draw unto them those which have not arrived at the same level of culture." End quote. None of the three parties composing the French Popular Front government of 1936-38, namely the Radical Party, the Socialist Party, and the Communist Party, was, quote, unconditionally anti-colonial, and their devotion to reform was, quote, at best equivocal. When out of government, all three parties opposed particular colonialist policies, especially military expeditions, but abandoned their critical stance when entering government. Despite earlier opposition to colonialism, by the turn of the last century, the majority of France's Radical Party favored colonial empire, albeit a reformed one, ostensibly more attuned to the interests of the native population. At the same time, although French socialists before the First World War had, quote, generous explosions of indignation, it was difficult for them to avoid being accustomed to colonialism, to accepting the empire implicitly, end quote. Whereas the leading force within the Popular Front, the SFIO tended to urge a conservative approach to colonial policy, quote, even encouraging repression. The Radical Party actively supported repression. French Jacobin nationalism and perceptions of French cultural superiority did not provide a fertile ground for internationalism. The overwhelming majority of French socialists came to identify French well-being with the fate of mankind, France's mission civilisatrice, with only a minority current voicing largely rhetorical opposition to colonialism. In relation to Algeria, for instance, the great majority of French socialists and the French labor movement were unambiguously colonialists, with both social democratic and communist branches in the colony thoroughly infused with settler colonial ideology and exerting considerable conservative pressure on the respective metropolitan parties. Class and national questions surrounding land ownership, labor conditions, political representation, and cultural advancement for the majority Arab population were elided in favor of the assimilation through the education system of a narrow Arab elite. In Britain, the Labour Party, though struggling to obtain and keep power for much of the last century, forming a government briefly in 1924, between 1929 and 31, 45 and 51, 64 and 70, 74 and 76, and between 1997 and 2007, a total of 27 years, received a plurality of working and middle-class support for its agenda, having over 380,000 members in 2016. Though Tickelman is perhaps correct that British Labour was more accommodating to anti-colonial demands than its influential French or German counterparts, its class basis in the metropolitan Labour aristocracy denied it genuine democratic potential. Defense of imperialist capitalism has proved to be a more pressing and less distant imperative for British Labour to pursue than the construction of socialism. If anti-colonialism is defined as a commitment, quote, first, to the basic equality of European and non-European peoples and cultures, and to the right of all nations to self-determination, and secondly, to political action aimed at eradicating colonialism in one's own country as well as in others, and to international as well as national work, end quote, then there was very little of it displayed by the European labor movement before the Second World War. Whereas the British labor movement was more tacitly than actively supportive of empire before the 1920s. Afterwards, it developed its own colonial policy. British Labour's interest in the colonies in the interwar years was primarily motivated by two concerns. First, there was apprehension that the British Empire might completely collapse as a result of the rise of national liberation movements throughout the colonies. Second, the example set by Bolshevism and the anti-imperialist Communist International it had founded also provoked realistic fears of the empire's disintegration. Since many anti-colonial activists came to identify increasingly with Communist internationalism as a force for national liberation, the British Labour Party, particularly when in power in 1924, began to belatedly focus on the prudent formulation of colonial policy. While it is important to recognize the efforts of minority sections of British social democracy to advocate greater self-reliance for the colonial countries, even veteran left Labour notable Fenner Brockway, despite being considered a prominent opponent of colonialism on humanitarian grounds, had denounced the anti-colonial peasant Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, and later became a member of the House of Lords. In fact, the prevailing concern of the Labour Party has been and continues to be the profitability of British capital. It is worth quoting British Marxist historian Robert Clough at length. Beginning of long quote. This is the real story of the Labour Party, how it used the RAF to defend the British Empire against the Kurdish and Indian people, approved the use of battleships against the Chinese people to maintain the games of the Opium Wars, used headhunters against Malayan freedom fighters, later on tortured and interned Irish nationalists, approved the torture and internment of Muslims, and defends the Zionist occupation of Palestine. It is the story of Labour's racism, its description of Africans as non-adult people, its decades of connivance with South African apartheid, its continuous support for racist immigration controls and asylum laws. It is the story of a left wing which constantly sanctioned such terror because it saw its membership of the Labour Party as of greater importance than the fate of millions suffering under the iron heel of Labour imperialism. It is the story of a party which, representing a small, privileged section of the working class, has constantly betrayed the interests of the mass, though surely not a majority, of the working class. Unemployed workers, Black, Asian, and Irish people, all those engaged in a struggle against the British state. It is the story of a party which has made a mockery of the words freedom, democracy, and socialism. End quote from Clough. All of this without, of course, mentioning the Labour Party's prosecution of the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, the catastrophic invasion and occupation of Afghanistan in 2001, or the equally criminal, genocidal war and sanctions the Labour government waged against Iraq, killing over 1 million and displacing many more so as to maintain the petrodollar financing of the neoliberal economy, and with it the institutional foundations of imperialist globalization. In Germany, the only party in the Reichstag that was to oppose the demand for the restitution of all German colonies after the First World War was the small independent Social Democratic Party, USPD, which attempted a middle course between Bolshevism and social democratic revisionism. With some exceptions, however, the German left did not overly preoccupy itself with colonial matters. In the Netherlands, a large number of people found work or settled in its large and lucrative Southeast Asian colonies, and many more had direct material and personal ties with colonialism. This reality exerted a formidable colonialist influence on public opinion, affecting the parliamentary reformist Social Democratic Labour Party, SDAP, and the labor movement more broadly. However, since the Dutch colonies were not the object of fierce inter-imperialist rivalry, and did not therefore become a major electoral issue, there was some scope for left liberal criticism of colonial policy in Indonesia, albeit within the parameters of support for colonialism and opposition to the national liberation of the colonies. End of section.